The revelation landed like a physical blow. Bridget's lab results were indisputable, clinical, and mercilessly plain. Luna's unborn child was not Will's. There had been no tampering, no switched vials, no elaborate sabotage to produce a false positive. The science had spoken, and it annihilated a future someone had already been counting on. Luna's face, when Bridget delivered the verdict in that cold, fluorescent lit room, was a map of shock curdling into something far darker than sorrow. She disappeared before anyone could process the fallout. Her ankle monitor stayed active, pinging the same unfamiliar grid over and over. So it wasn't a simple vanishing act. It was a calculated run. Will and Bridget were ruined. Billy, who had quietly shepherded the fragile hope that the child might anchor Will back to a more stable path, felt the betrayal like a public humiliation. Bill, furious and convinced that the only way to get answers was to follow the signal himself, went to the location the tracker had shown. He imagined a confrontation, accusations, maybe the messy unraveling of seduction, lies and motives. He did not imagine the trap. The scene Bill walked into was staged with the precision of someone who'd planned for every variable. He was struck from behind before he could call out, a hard, hot pain exploding at the base of his skull, and then the world folded into black. When consciousness returned, the room had a dull, echoing quality. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and his limbs felt foreign, bound, immobile, wrists and ankles wrapped tight with rough cord. The sunlight through the high window painted the dust motes like slow invaders. Bill's heart pounded with the animal panic of a man who knows he is at someone else's mercy. He heard movement, a soft, steady breath, the scuff of shoes on concrete, then a voice he recognized but could not place at first because it was too thin with fury and something like triumph. Luna stepped into view, hair wild, eyes narrow and bright, a small knife catching daylight in her hand like an accusation. She looked nothing like the fragile woman who'd once wept over stolen moments and misread signals. This Luna was made of desperate, honed resolve. She stepped close enough for him to smell the cheap perfume and the metallic tang of adrenaline and said, without preface, that she had been planning for a long time. An elegant, cold line about survival and what people would do when they'd been denied their chance. She blamed Bill for thwarting her plan. She accused him of turning up the heat, of crushing the arrangement she'd relied on, of conspiring, by dint of his interference, to make her lose everything. Her words were knife-sharp even before she lifted the real one. Remy was there, standing just over her shoulder like a man who had taken a vow and then discovered the cost. He had been the muscle, the willing accomplice. He'd struck Bill down and bound him as instructed. Now his face betrayed inner turbulence. His jaw worked. His eyes flicked from Luna to Bill to the exit as if measuring the distance to regret. He had helped because Luna had asked him to. Because debt, loyalty, and the promise of protection had made his fear pliable. And because in that fevered moment he had told himself he could control consequences that, in truth, had already been set loose. Luna's voice dropped to a whisper when she leaned toward Bill, knife poised, and she said she would end him. That death was a simple remedy for the chaos he'd created. That in killing him she would seal off humiliation, exposure, the ruin of whatever future she had imagined. Bill swallowed and found his own voice, rough with both fear and shameless bargaining. He offered money, power, threats, old weapons that had felled men before. Yet Luna seemed uninterested in anything but the finality of his silence. Will's name came out of Bill's lips like a plea, and Luna's laugh was brittle. She wanted more than vengeance. She wanted to erase the architecture of a life she felt had been stolen. She spoke of plans layered with lies, of promises she'd been forced to keep, of a bill of goods she'd sold others in exchange for security. And how Bridget's test had demolished the foundation. There were shades of motive here that went beyond petty scheming. Luna had been cornered by a world that commodified her, by men who decided paternity like ledger entries. And in her mind Bill had become the final, unavoidable obstacle, the man who could still pull the strings and make the truth painless for everyone else but let her drown. So she was going to take control of the one thing left to her, a life or a death, and decide the terms. For a breathless moment nothing else existed but the click of the blade and the hot hammering of Bill's pulse. Then Remy, who had stood silent like a sentinel, made a move that fractured the plan. Maybe it was guilt, maybe the sight of a man he'd admired, however begrudgingly, tied and terrified, snapped something loose. Maybe the weight of his own child's face had appeared in his mind and reminded him of the hardness and cost of true violence. He stepped forward and grabbed Luna's wrist, and the knife clattered away on the concrete, a sound like a bell tolling for all of them. Luna's face crumpled, not with remorse but with a swift, panicked recalculation. There were consequences to this moment she hadn't accounted for. Police scanners in parked cruisers far from sight but not unreachable. The ankle monitor's geofenced alerts already pinging the station. The thin thread of technology that had exposed her running now like a wire to her capture. Bill, ragged and furious, used the distraction. He twisted against the ropes with the stubborn energy of survival. Got a thumb under a binding. Scored a small cut. Tasted copper on his tongue and didn't care because every fraction of movement was a chance. He lunged, not toward retribution but toward the knife. And for an awful, terrifying second Luna and he were wild animals circling fate. The blade rose. It found flesh but not the vital places Luna had spoken of. The cut into Bill's forearm was a jagged, blazing scream of pain, not death. Blood spattered, hot and urgent, and it changed everything. The room filled with raw, human sound. Bill's curse, Luna's sob, Remy's frantic apologies. In those seconds the possibility of murder collapsed under the weight of immediate consequence. It was messy, imperfect, and primal. It was also, strangely, a moment of clarity. Luna, reeling from the pain she had inflicted and the sight of blood on her hands, suddenly saw herself as others might, not a triumphant avenger but a frightened woman who'd nearly crossed an irrevocable threshold. The sirens that had seemed like a myth by the time the ankle monitor pinged the station turned into a distant wail that grew nearer. And with their approach came bright lights and the authoritative voices of officers who had pieced together from digital breadcrumbs and a neighbor's late-night call. Found the address. Will's name was called out, then Bridget's, then Bill's. Someone shouted for medical support. Luna made one last, desperate move. She shoved Remy away, scrambled for the window, and in that instant Remy did what he would have to live with for the rest of his life. He lunged after her, not with a fist but with a hand to stop, to plead, to anchor. The police reached the door and were in like a storm. Commands shouted, holsters revealed, hands catching wrists. Luna fought. She screamed about betrayal. She screamed that the world had made her choose ugliness to survive. She screamed for fate to be kinder. The officers, trained to measure and react, cuffed her with clinical efficiency while the paramedics tended Bill's bleeding arm and steadied him enough to ride the wave of shock. Remy's hands shook as he sat on the curb in the flashing light and realized the scope of his choices. The cost of being the accomplice and the man who, in the end, had tried to stop a murder he'd once enabled. The next days were a legal crucible. Bridget's report was in police hands. Will, dignified and tremulous, cooperated with investigators who probed the rack of relationships and motives. Billy, bloodied and embarrassed and somehow still furious, supplied testimony that stitched together a narrative of deceit and desperation. Luna, who had vanished once only to be found with rope and knife and a plan that had nearly ended a life, sat through hearings with the wild, haunted eyes of someone who had convinced herself of necessity and then watched necessity become monstrous. In court, the prosecution painted a picture of premeditation. The defense argued mania and fear and delusion. A woman pushed past the limits. Remy pleaded his involvement with the shame of a man who had loved badly, or been loved into mistake. And he testified about Luna's voice in the nights before, about Conrad's quiet bargains and the whisper of promises that had never been fulfilled. Will's forgiveness was complicated. Public sympathy softened him, but privately he staggered through a grief that was part loss of possibility and part terror at what can happen when human beings are forced into impossible boxes by money, power and fear. Bill's wound healed but left a pale, stubborn scar, a reminder of hubris and the edge of mortality. The baby, always the pivot around which all this spun, became a legal and emotional focal point. Welfare checks, social services, and the slow, bureaucratic work of determining guardianship, paternity and protection for a child born into a maelstrom of publicity. In the quiet aftermath, when cameras retreated and the boardrooms resumed their chess games, people took stock. Bridges were burned and slowly rebuilt. Some relationships refused repair. Luna's choices left ripple effects. New alliances formed out of mutual outrage or compassion. Secrets surfaced that had incubated in the margins. And the Forrester family, which had weathered corporate wars and romantic tumult, found itself having to reckon with the raw, human cost of being famous. Whatever sentence Luna faced, whatever redemption might be offered, the memory of the knife on the concrete, of Remy's conflicted face, of Bill's curse and Will's hollow stare, would linger. In the end, the city's lights dimmed on a story that had been played at full volume. A woman pushed to the brink, an ankle monitor that betrayed rather than saved, an attempted murder that became a cautionary stain on everyone involved. The moral lines had blurred into a grayness that no one could easily scrub clean. And as the cameras turned to the next scandal, the people left behind had to sleep with the knowledge that sometimes survival becomes monstrous. And sometimes monsters look shockingly like victims. Will had been trying to shut it all out, Bridget's testimony. The press chewing up the story. The humiliation of knowing the child was not his and the world now knew it too. He'd been retreating into long hours and longer silences when the envelope appeared at his door. No return address. Just his name scrawled in ink that looked hurried, almost frantic. Inside was a single photograph. Bill, his father, bound hand and foot on a dirty floor. A dark stain under his shoulder that could only be blood. And next to the photo, a slip of paper with an address Will had never seen before. A crumbling warehouse on the edge of an industrial district where the city forgot to patrol. For a second Will couldn't breathe. He told himself it was another manipulation. Another ploy in the circus that Luna and her allies had spun around them. But the blood on the floor looked too real. And the faint outline of his father's watch on the pale wrist was unmistakable. His stomach turned. He didn't call anyone. He grabbed his keys and went. The warehouse was almost silent when he arrived. The address matched the envelope exactly. The front door had been left ajar as if someone wanted him to come in. A faint coppery smell hit him immediately, metallic and wrong. He called out his father's name but only his own echo came back. Inside, under a single flickering strip light, was Bill. He lay on his side on the concrete. Still bound, his once immaculate shirt shredded and soaked through with dark, spreading blood, multiple stab wounds, some shallow and ragged, others deep enough to have already begun pooling on the floor around him. His face was pale gray, his eyes fluttered but didn't focus. "Dad," Will's voice cracked, the sound bouncing off the bare walls. He dropped to his knees, cradling Bill's head, his hands immediately slick with his father's blood. "No, no, no, stay with me, please," Bill tried to speak. The words came out wet and broken. But Will caught fragments. Luna Remy trap, and then nothing but a cough that sent more red onto his lips. Will pressed his palms to the wounds the way they teach you in training videos he'd half watched. But there were too many. The life was draining out of Bill faster than Will could stop it. The blood wouldn't stop. His own breath became frantic sobs. "You're not dying here. Not like this. You can't." Bill's hand twitched weakly, then went slack. Will's world turned soundless. The flickering light above seemed to stutter slower, the shadows stretching long. He felt himself rocking with his father's body, whispering apologies he couldn't even hear himself say. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had come to save him, to fix something, but instead he had walked straight into the aftermath of a murder he felt complicit in. Because it was his fault. In Will's mind, every thread led back to him. If he hadn't doubted Luna so publicly, if he hadn't pressed for tests, if he hadn't goaded his father to chase her, if he hadn't been so quick to expose her, to humiliate her, to cut off every escape until desperation became a weapon, Bill was dead because Will had cornered a woman who had nothing left to lose. The thought settled in his chest like a brand. When the sound came, a soft creak of a door above him, he spun, but the catwalk overhead was empty except for a flash of movement he couldn't place. Someone had been there, watching. Maybe Luna herself, or Remy, or some other ghost of this twisted mess. Whoever it was, they were gone before Will could even stand. He held his father one last time, rocking, whispering promises and oaths. Then he set Bill down gently on the concrete, wiped the blood from his face with trembling hands, and rose. His eyes were not the same as when he had come in. They were flat, fixed, a storm bottled behind his brow. He knew, as surely as he knew his own name, what came next. Luna. He would find her. He would not call the police. He would not wait for investigations or trials. He would hunt her down the way she had hunted Bill. Every mile of her escape, every alley, every safe house Remy had lined up for her, he would strip away. He would track her like an animal and make her see what it felt like to lose everything. He whispered it once into the empty warehouse. "I'm going to find you." Then he stepped out into the night, leaving behind the blood and the silence, carrying only the photograph and a vow as sharp as a blade. Somewhere out there, Luna thought she had gotten away. But Will's grief had calcified into something else. And whatever came next in Los Angeles would not be a police procedural or a courtroom drama. It would be a reckoning. Personal, relentless, and written in the same red that stained his hands now. Will was no longer the man who had stumbled into this scandal blind. He was a man with nothing left to lose. And Luna had just become the center of a vendetta that would consume them both.